All right, Alyssa, we are going to chat for a few minutes about a question that we got over email about how to respond when an employee complains about those other duties as assigned. So this is our segment called Mail Time. So I got an email from Missy who asks, I have 2 staff who always say they need more of a raise for, quote, performance, one of which is usually just doing the things in her job. The other does a few more things around here related to some other duties and is sometimes on call when some other people are off. And she also does some new hire training for us in her role, but they're constantly asking for more pay, more compensation. How do I handle this? Do I just shut up and listen and then ask them what they think is reasonable and fair? Should I be paying them more for these kinds of other duties, even though it doesn't feel like it, even though it feels to me like these are things that are just a part of the job when you're a more experienced employee? What say you? And so I thought that would be an interesting topic for us. Where would you like to start?
Well, I love, other duties as assigned, because if that isn't the last line of every job description I have ever written in my entire 20-year career of an HR professional, I don't know what it is. I think this is an interesting juxtaposition to our initial conversation about productivity, right? And what I wonder is, are these other duties that they're talking about, is it something that they are truly adding value to the organization with? And maybe that's where we need to explore and get a little bit more clear. Because again, this mythology of I'm doing more, the quantity, the volume of what I'm doing, is more.
Yes.
Isn't necessarily, again, required to get reciprocal compensation. What we have to do is also be fair enough to recognize when we are continually asking people to do things that are going to take up more of their time, that is bringing more value to the organization than perhaps we might want to recognize, or that we have in the past recognized, and discern, is that something that is perhaps compensable through bonus or on an as needed basis, rather than here's a 50-cent increase per hour kind of thing. These are the thoughts that go through my brain, again, in correlation to this conversation we've just had about productivity, and then having this kind of, historical HR context to bring to the muddle the mix too. What are your thoughts? Where do you start whenever you think about this issue?
So there are a couple of angles here. And I think it starts with what I know about how motivation works at work. What we know is that extrinsic motivators like pay and benefits are like a shot of caffeine. Often, if you reward people with them, you may get upticks in mood and appreciation and performance. But for some folks, that will wear off and they will return to baseline. And so if what we have in this circumstance is someone who doesn't feel appreciated or is complaining, this may not solve the problem. And so that's the kind of first part of this. Complaints like these often are symptoms of an underlying issue where the employee is not feeling valued. Sometimes they occur, when the employee has been with the organization for a long time and is perhaps looking around and seeing, I have more experience, I do more. In either case, sometimes more affirmation from people higher up in the org chart can go a long way to diffusing that frustration. The other side of this, though, is that if you have continued to add duties to someone's plate, it isn't out of bounds for the employee to ask or to feel like they should be compensated differently or additionally for that work. I think the question we as leaders have to ask is this person working beyond the scope of their job role as outlined? If the answer is yes, then additional pay really might be warranted. And there's such a gray area here, because I always ask this question of leaders when I do various kinds of leadership training. Let's say you work in a hospital. Do you expect something different from a nurse with 8 years of experience than you do from a nurse with 8 months of experience in terms of how they show up? And almost every leader says yes. And when you ask employees that, if you ask a room full of nurses, do you expect a nurse with 8 years of experience to show up differently than a nurse with 8 months of experience? They all say yes too. So there's a tacit acknowledgement that experience influences scope of performance and scope of responsibilities. And so that's where I come back to the job description. We have to look at market. We have to look at so many other factors. What I suggest leaders do is engage in an ongoing conversation to figure out, is this person not feeling valued? What's triggering these questions and thoughts? Sometimes just asking them what they're looking for, especially if your salary structures or the roles as they're defined in the organization, maybe this person's capped out in their their salary structure. Asking them, yes, you're right. We have you doing some more new hire training, and you're doing some things that other people aren't. What could we provide you in value in exchange for that? They may not always tell you it's money. Maybe they want some more flexibility in their schedule. Maybe that's the kind of extra that they're looking for. Maybe it's just a perk. If you're pointing to someone and saying, we want you to do this thing because you're really good at it, you're better than everybody else, and you have more experience, then yeah, let's provide an exchange of value, but it doesn't always have to be money. So those are all of my kind of thoughts rattling around in my head as well.
I love it. Sometimes we're like, the thoughts aren't the same, but the ideas weave together this like whole picture that if you can't get something out of what each of our perspectives, then you're not looking. Because I feel like that was like a whole dang 360 of all the different perspectives you need to consider and some very practical advice and strategies to take forward.
And if nothing else, being able to sit down with that person and saying, especially if you can't do anything relative to additional compensation, just being completely honest about that and saying, I understand what you're asking. I understand why you're asking, but this is not something that's possible. So how do we resolve it? Can you disagree with what your salary is, but commit anyway? We used some of that language here before on the podcast. If you need to pursue other opportunities that you feel more fairly compensate you, then I'll support you in that. I'm going to be an advocate for you. And if you go across the street and you figure out the grass wasn't really greener there and you want to come back, I hope I'm your first phone call. Sometimes we just have to be an ally and an advocate for people and not necessarily try to disagree with whether they should or shouldn't get something, as opposed to just saying, well, if you are in pursuit of this, here's what's possible here and here's what's not.
Well said. Well said.